Hello and welcome to this lunchtime chat at the Royal Economic Society annual conference. I'm Stephanie Flanders, I'm head of Bloomberg Economics and senior executive editor for economics at Bloomberg. I know that this is a pretty hardcore few days, those who've been watching a lot of it, and occasionally for those who aren't deep in the profession, it's a little bit hard to immediately recognize the practical relevance and importance of the studies that people are providing. Normally it's there buried somewhere, but you might need a bit of help. This topic that we're talking about today, I don't think anyone will need any help in thinking about how directly relevant and important these topics are for public policy, but for all of us as we lead our lives and think about the way the global economy is going. We're thinking about platforms, machine learning, and privacy, with a couple of people who have made really important and interesting contributions to the thinking, academic thinking in this area. Dirk Bergemann, who's now Douglas and Marion Campbell Professor of Economics at Yale University, and I note that he's also currently co-editor of the American Economic Review, and Noam Yuchtman, who's Professor of Managerial Economics and Strategy at the London School of Economics. How we're going to run this, we've only got 45 minutes. There's a huge number of topics we could discuss. So what I actually asked the two speakers to do was to kick off by speaking pretty briefly, 5 to 8 minutes, about what their academic interests are and specifically how they play into some of these important questions around platforms and privacy and the things we think about every day. And then we'll have time for some discussion amongst ourselves, and I'll be looking at the questions. If you submit questions onto that website, I will see them and hopefully feed them into the conversation as we reach an end at 1:15 UK time. So Dirk's going to kick off, and I think he also has a few slides. Dirk, if you want, over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Stephanie, for that very nice introduction. So let me try to share my slides with you in a format that is going to be able. It's a very nice occasion to meet with Noam and with Stephanie and talk about the issues of platforms, machine learning, and privacy. I should probably tell you just a little bit background about myself. I'm trained as a microeconomist. I'm most interested in doing research in game theory and information economics, and in particular in market design. And so if following our discussion here today, you have any questions, please feel free to reach out at my email at Yale. Let me talk about some of the themes in my research, and then maybe about two recent research papers to perhaps open up a little bit discussions and talk about the big issues that we're facing when we think about data, the role of platforms on the internet, and privacy. My early work was focused about how information, in particular sequential and dynamic information over time and learning more generally, influence individual and social choices. And I focus there on using a statistical learning technology, often referred to as multi-arm bandits, to think about how we can organize in a strategic, in an interactive sense, learning. This notion of multi-arm bandits is now basically the central notion by which we think about learning can happen on platforms and is supported by machine learning. So it's a really key idea for learning and machine learning in particular. My interest then shifted a little bit, motivated by that interest, to think about how we can aggregate information of individuals that is highly heterogeneous, decentralized, and asynchronous in a robust and scalable way, so scalable to the size of the internet. And of course, if you think about one of the big advances and one of the huge steps forward that we made with the internet is that we have an incredible ability to bring information from individuals that are completely independent, decentralized together And that point of view really informs today even computer scientists, in the sense that we don't think about a network as a centrally engineered entity anymore, but rather as a highly decentralized interactive system of individual units, individual systems. Some of them are bigger, some of them are smaller, but this is really sort of the new view of how we think about the internet, or how we think about a system being run on the internet. And most recently, I've been thinking about to what extent information can replace traditionally monetary incentive to influence and steer behavior. And so with course that I refer to that as information design. So how can we design optimally to influence, persuade, and steer behavior? And if you think about the role that the large internet platforms, digital platforms playing, then yes, they sometimes set prices, but more often they're actually concerned about designing the delivery of information that is very, very high dimensional into a low dimensional representation that helps us making decisions, or maybe steers us in making decisions. So really we can think about the platforms as gigantic information designers, and a lot of experimentation is going on around how to best, or how to most influentially represent information. Let me quickly talk about two very recent research papers that are forthcoming or working in progress. Those are together with my colleague here at MIT, Alessandro Bonatti. I'm just enjoying my sabbatical. The one paper, The Economics of Social Data, starts with the observation that we really have, through the rise of the large internet platforms, seen an incredible increase in the amount of collection and then use of individual user data. So think about Amazon, Facebook, Google in the US, but in many ways perhaps even more impressive in terms of the scale and the depths and the detailedness of the data. Think about JD, Tencent, Alibaba in China. What those databases and what those platforms are doing is they're generating, or rather they are recording massive amounts of data about the individual consumers, and those are about their preferences, their shopping behavior, their location, very importantly, their friends, their political views. So it's really a very broad and but at the same time very deep view of individual behavior. And we come to appreciate this information in terms of the services that deliver, and think about search results that we're really using daily, think about product recommendations, think about informativeness ratings, think about our use of traffic data, all of this, or targeted advertising, all of these we come to rely on a daily basis. And they're useful. But I think what has been, and that was the scope of the paper, and the sort of the warning perhaps that we would like to issue, is that really this collection of individual data is all about its social dimension, namely by acquiring information about the individual user. Really what the platform or any third party gains is data about all of the users that are similar to that individual users in some dimension. So really what the platforms are acquiring are social data, and it's precisely the social dimension of the data that is driving the value of the digital services, in the sense that it allows them to infer and then predict behavior of others from the data of the customers they just have gained information about. Okay. So think about shopping data that, for example, Amazon gets with every purchase you make. It conveys information not only about the willingness to pay of the individual, but in fact about all of consumers which have a similar purchase history or similar browsing history. And the key insight here that I think is critical when we think about how efficient are data markets, or how efficient can we think data markets are run, is that really the social nature of the data generates a significant informational externality, or call this data externality. And this externality is at least sort of the significance and importance in terms of scale as externalities that we come to expect from environmental discussions, so emissions externality. What makes it a much harder object to talk about and then to think about with policy is that, of course, in the environmental environment, we know what the sign of the externality is, namely that the emission is a negative externality. The information externality, we can't really design in terms of its impact on a large group of agents a priori. Much of it depends on how it is being used, what the underlying market structure is, what the use of the information is. If you're just using it to match, say, services and consumers, it has an unambiguously positive effect. But we can also use it to price discriminate and shift the distribution of the surplus, then all of a sudden it takes on a very different. So, but what I guess I would like to bring to this discussion, that really the presence of the data externality, the presence of the social dimension of the data should make us very wary about statements that says the market will solve the problem of allocating data efficiently. Okay. An ongoing work on data competition in digital platform is trying to it's surprising that we don't actually have made much more progress in this direction, but is to think about digital platform as basically satisfying two roles that interact in a very important and significant way, in sort of a complementary way. Namely, one is that platforms are information gatekeepers, so they take in a lot of information, but they also have a lot of control of how much information actually then is being returned to the consumers, to the producers, or to other parties. At the same time, they are really managers of competition. So if you think about Google managing the competition of the advertisers, or Amazon managing the competition of the third-party sellers, then they really are making markets and are in control of the markets, both in terms of the rules of the allocation, but also in terms of the rules of the information. And so that can be very powerful because it can help matching. It can help also influence the price setting. But of course, it gives them naturally a size and a scale that brings them very close to being in a monopoly position. And interesting, the structure of these platforms, you know, if you think about Google, Amazon, eBay, Uber, they share very many common features if you look sort of at the underlying abstract in terms of both managing information and managing competition. And so we should be concerned about how much surplus these market makers can extract from restricting information and competition. And it's perhaps, and that might be one of the opening points that we discuss, it's an area where privacy and competition policy interact rather, and they should interact in the sense that we need to consider them jointly rather than thinking of these two different discussions that have nothing to do with each other. So that's sort of my opening piece that hopefully can contribute a little bit to our discussion.
Fantastic, thank you, Dirk. And as you suggested, there's a lot of different directions we can go in from some of those considerations. And I think the point about the data externality is well taken. Noam, if you want to kick us off.
Sure. Thanks so much, and yeah, it is a real pleasure to have a chance to talk with Dirk and Stephanie. Just to introduce myself to the audience, I'm a political economist, I would say, and my training is in the fields of labor economics and economic history. You might wonder, you know, how do you get from there to thinking about data-intensive technology and platforms? I'll give you a sense. First, you know, my training as a historian led me to think about processes of long-run economic change, often in a comparative perspective. And of course, the process of technical change that we're going through now has been described as a fourth industrial revolution, and the rise of data-intensive innovation is something that you know, I think generates interest among anyone with an interest in economic change. my training as a labor economist grounded a lot of my work in the analysis of microeconomic data, and is oriented around trying to identify causal relationships using microeconomic data. And so I take that approach to the analysis of these economic changes that grab my interest, from the perspective of being, let's say, an economic historian and political economist. The political economy side of me, which is really present in the vast majority of my work, leads me to think about the role of political institutions, political actors, and oftentimes states and governments in shaping economic outcomes. And I think this is a really nice complement actually to Dirk's work in the sense that you were just presented with some of the biggest economic players and even beyond economic, social and political players in the world of modern innovation coming from the private sector. My work is complementary in the sense of thinking about the role of the government. And so I applied these perspectives of thinking about processes of economic change and innovation, an attempt to use microeconomic data to identify causal relationships, and a role for political institutions in a set of projects with co-authors Martin Baraha, Andrew Cao, and David Yang, that are all examining the role of political institutions, and in particular governments, in shaping AI innovation, and exploring different dimensions of the relationship between governments, government data, and private sector innovation, affecting, I think, in some ways, every aspect of our lives. So what do we do in this work? Well, we start with just a point, a descriptive point that I think is often overlooked in conversations about data. And this is not to say that Dirk was overlooking anything, but Dirk's presentation was very much focused where most of us have focused in thinking about big data, and the major data sets and actors using those data sets to drive innovation, and that is the private sector. And yet, data intensive innovation, being based on enormous data sets, has a clear interest also in government data collection, and in some domains, some very important economic sectors as well, government data far exceed what's possessed by the private sector. And so you can think about this in the domain of surveillance, where the surveillance camera networks in certain countries exceed the capacity of the private sector to observe faces and people in motion. If we think about health data, you think about how much data the NHS has at different sort of levels of human health and well-being. If you think about geospatial data, government data sets in certain domains are potentially enormously valuable as an input into machine learning, artificial intelligence, and other technologies. Now, what makes these government data sets particularly valuable, maybe surprisingly valuable, is that they aren't just useful for the provision of government services to the population. So you might think, okay, NHS data is extremely valuable because NHS data can be paired with, let's say, Amazon's Alexa AI, as is being done, to provide better government services. In fact, that's true, but the impact is potentially much broader. So access to government data isn't just valuable in producing for the government. It can actually be used to develop a broader range of innovations to commercial applications. And the reason is that the types of data that are used to train a machine learning algorithm for a particular purpose, let's say for a government service project, can also be used to train algorithms that are applied to commercial purposes. The algorithms that are developed, let's say, to identify an individual in a government surveillance application could also be used to identify consumers in a commercial application as well. And so this sort of, Dirk talked about one type of externality. This is another type of spillover arising from data access. Data accessed for one purpose can be used to develop technologies for other purposes as well.
No, can I just stop you for 1 second and ask you just to tilt up your, we're losing half your face.
Oh,
That's
sorry.
better.
Thank you. Yeah, I don't
That's
see
good.
me. I'm full screen PDF, so thank
No,
you.
that's right.
I appreciate
Okay,
that. Is
great.
this better?
That is better, yes.
Great. Sorry, you can't. You know, I would love for you to see my full smiling. So what we do in our work is really study this potential link between government data and broader innovation, and we do that in a context that we think is quite high stakes and really at the technological frontier in AI, which is the facial recognition AI sector in China. And my co-authors and I have put together comprehensive data on government procurement of AI services. That procurement is what gives private firms access to government data. And then we can study the innovation of those private firms in the facial recognition sector. Using these comprehensive data sets, we find that firms' access to more government data through a procurement relationship stimulates not just more government-oriented software innovation, but actually more commercial software AI innovation as well. Interestingly, and beginning to relate to concerns about privacy and the social consequences of AI innovation and data-intensive technology, we find evidence that this sort of relationship between firms and the government can generate a sort of mutual reinforcement between autocracy and innovation, in the sense that the Chinese government procures AI in response to local political unrest, that AI is useful in repressing unrest, and that procurement used for political purposes stimulates further AI innovation, which then can feed back into reinforcing the autocracy. And so that directly raises concerns about the links between data collection, data provision to firms, and social consequences. Now, this is important in thinking about what's going on in China. It's also important in thinking about what might happen around the world. So China, through its massive data collection, so like many autocracies, China is heavily involved in monitoring its population. That monitoring generates data. Those data are valuable inputs into innovation, and that is forming the basis for a comparative advantage in AI, and in particular at this moment in surveillance AI, which has led to the proliferation of Chinese trade deals in AI around the world. This has important implications. So one is we have to think about government data collection and its provision to firms as a source of innovation policy. Governments aren't just monitoring populations to provide security. They're not just collecting data on our health to provide health services. How these data are collected and how they're shared with firms functions as innovation policy. And you know, around the world, governments and states that want to be economically competitive need to think about government data as a valuable input in innovation. That's not just true for growth. It's also important for thinking about industrial organization and competition. So how and which firms get access to government data can play a crucial role in determining the extent of data founded monopolies in different sectors. This role of government data in innovation also, of course, directly raises concerns and trade-offs between innovation on the one hand, driven by data collection and provision to firms, and of course, privacy or civil liberties considerations that arise when our data is collected and provided to others. That's a domestic issue, and I think there are interesting policy discussions to be had. There are also interesting technological opportunities and challenges that come out of thinking about this trade-off. And in addition, thinking also globally, the role of government data, in particular government data collected in contexts that don't share our ethical values, raises questions about the need for regulating trade in data-intensive technology. So the same way that we worry about the sourcing of labor upstream in the supply chain, we may worry about the sourcing of data in the supply chain and the ethical standards applied, which again opens up a range of interesting policy questions internationally. So looking forward to talking about some of these topics with the group here and taking questions from the audience. Thanks.
Noam and Dirk, thank you so much. And I should just encourage anyone who wants to raise questions. We're not going to have, I mean, these are such weighty issues, and we could go in a lot of different directions, and we have very little time. But I would encourage people to put questions onto the website where you've been encouraged to put them. I mean, obviously, you both have come at things from a slightly different direction, and it's interesting because it obviously meet on these concerns around competition and market power, but also government power in a kind of raw sense when you're thinking about the surveillance capability that's now being developed in China and other autocracies. Just to sort of go back a little onto a sort of basic question, and maybe Dirk first. I mean, as you rightly said, we have to think about privacy and competition policy together because of this the incredible kind of market power and ability to extract consumer surplus that this data affords companies. And this is data that they've got themselves, not necessarily from governments. You know, a common conversation I would have with some sort of senior people at some of these platforms who I've known over the years, and you ask them sort of about their response to the question of regulation, and everyone's sort of certainty that there needs to be more regulation of the likes of Amazon or particularly Facebook. And their response is often, well, it's all very well, but you know, everyone knows that they want regulation, but not what regulation. How are you going to do it? What exactly are you regulating? Do you feel, I mean, Dirk, but I think also Noam, do you feel like your work is helping governments get any closer to an answer to that, or at least clarify the questions that we're trying to address when we think about regulating these behemoths? Dirk, you're on mute, I think.
Certainly, I think we would hope that it does, but I think it does in a sense that you know, the questions that we're raising, the concept that we're developing, sort of the analytical framework that in particular I think economists are very good in developing, without necessarily sort of the details that the engineer would have, allows us to think about where we can start, what might be the principles that guide any policy, and also perhaps guides us where we need to acquire information, expertise, and knowledge first, because we even take the first steps in terms of designing the rules. I think these issues are really very much frontier issues, in the sense that some of the problems that Facebook got itself into, you know, think about Cambridge Analytica, came out of a desire actually inside Facebook to learn more about what's the most valuable use of the data. And they realized that just inside Facebook running experiments is probably not enough to learn about how the data can be made valuable in many dimensions. And so they gave access of this data to many of their partners. Now, some partners were more trusted than others, but you know, the interesting aspect of this is that even the large platforms, they have an intuitive feeling that more data is better for them, but the exact way in which this data is valuable, what's the depreciation of the data, how much, you know, current versus stale data, how quickly that happens, all of that, I think, is something that the platforms are learning, the policymakers are learning, the regulators are learning. So to develop some concepts, analytic framework that helps us guide in terms of both where should we start investigating in terms of thinking what might be appropriate tools, but then also in terms of identifying where monopoly power, where market power may arise. I think for that, our work is very, very helpful and you know, and it's received positively by, say, by the regulators, the FTC or the FCC in the US, and then of course, and other institutions worldwide.
I mean, I guess, I mean, one of the issues, as far as Noam's talking about the situation where the private sector is getting information from government, but when it's the other way around and we're trying to grapple with the power of a company with its own that it has from its own information. You know, I guess what I was struck when I was listening to you, Dirk, is that even just what the information is not necessarily a given. I mean, it's certainly not transparent in the case of Facebook. Right. And how what they are doing with the information is profoundly opaque. So I guess that's also the obstacle. There's a massive asymmetry. It's an information asymmetry that governments have to get over right from the start.
Yes, that's right. So I think a first big thing to notice is that we clearly need to build up expertise and knowledge inside, you know, either public entities such as regulators or, you know, non-profit entities, and in order to be able to make sensible policy, because you know, some of the discussion in the European Union feels like there's a time lag between sort of the perception of the politicians of what information is, that goes sort of back to the view of what is in a print journal, whereas, you know, our conception of what data and information is in a digital platform is quite different and distinct and needs different tools. Nonetheless, I think, you know, we have lots of examples where we think about which we can use to think about how we want to conceive of data platform, data intermediaries. If we think about, we have regulations for health data, and so we want to think, would it be appropriate, or along which dimensions would it be appropriate to extend that simply to other data? We have a view of financial data. You know, where should financial data be kept? What kind of fiduciary duties do the various entities have? And so I think we should just, one starting point would be simply to say, well, should those be extended? Should there be regulatory agencies such as the SEC or the FDA that now broadly covers, you know, individual and social data and consumer data? Should that be the FTC, or should that be a different agency that requires expertise? I think these are sort of the big question, but I think Noam is right. This is a, you know, a fourth revolution, so we should expect to have new institutions arise in response to that, and those are going to be maybe initially small steps, but they're certainly eventually going to be, you know, we will have to create new institutions. We will have to create new agencies in order to harness really the benefits of the information, and to suppress some of the harm that might arise. And I think Noam's discussion of surveillance is very significant, because there was, I think, sort of around the turn of the century, a thought that more commercial development naturally leads to a liberalization, leads to democracy, and so attempts to further trade, say with China and say with Russia, was all being considered as furthering this path of development towards liberal societies and democratic societies. And the feedback loop that Noam just outlined actually showed that it might go rather in the opposite directions. And so it is not only important for us to face private companies, but I think our way of thinking about the use of data is also very important to restrain, the state, and to restrain the government where we can, and to be aware of sort of the pernicious influence of the state-led actors that comes, say, from China, and then move into liberal societies with this additional knowledge of data.
Yes, I mean, Noam, I had the same thought as I was listening to you, because there had been this kind of complacent, possibly naive expectation that the autocratic one-party regimes like China would at a certain point falter on the innovative front, because, you know, how could you innovate if you didn't have the kind of model of capitalist sort of individual entrepreneurship that the US has. And of course, we know that the US was not quite sort of pure entrepreneurship even in this area. But I'd be interested to hear your response to what Dirk was saying, and also the sort of more general question of how what your thinking around innovation, do you think that is helping or could help governments in Europe, say, or in the US, to sort of think more clearly about the trade-offs here?
Yeah, so I mean, I think first that the concern is a concern I share, that we were a bit naive, thinking that somehow, China might be able to catch up to the technological frontier, but it's something very different to move it out. And a big part of the work we're doing now is trying to explore these sources of competitive advantage or comparative advantage that China is able to get precisely from being an autocracy. Now, that said, I think it is worth saying also that this is one force that is driving innovation under autocracy, which may very well be important. And I think it's worth saying that access to data is crucial in AI innovation. But it's just one force that's driving in this direction, and there are other forces that may offset it. And so I think what we need to think about, sort of in a level-headed way, is sort of what are our advantages in the West, if I may say our advantages, come from, the openness of our society, the openness of our educational institutions, which continue to attract some of the very best and brightest students in computer science from China. And many of those Chinese students come to our universities, stay in our societies, and develop thriving companies or work within thriving companies. And so I think, it's worth also emphasizing the strengths that we have in the West in developing this technology. And so I think what we need to think about in the West is how to sort of complement those strengths. I think some of that may also relate to as I said, sort of how the international community regulates data collection. So I think that there will be a race towards some sort of standard setting, whether it's formal or informal, in protecting privacy, in protecting civil liberties. I think to the extent that China is able to get out in front, then it may push for standards that are more consistent with the values that are in place there now. I think it may be very important for us in the West to start thinking about those standards, and try to generalize them. I think that's it.
It's interesting because many people would say this is one area where Europe has been certainly ahead of the US, and some of the approaches, particularly to data privacy, that were originally the private sector, the Googles and the Amazons, were outraged at these GDPR and various things, and then it became the model. It became the kind of acceptable face of regulation, even that they might support within the US context. But I think that at least some in the private sector would listen to what you'd said, Noam, at the beginning, and said, well, what he said has just proved our point, that things like GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, and the sort of privacy rules that we tend to applaud that have been put in place as guardrails in Europe are actually stifling our private sector innovation and handicapping us in this technological race. I mean, I guess, what's your response to that?
So I think, as I said, there's potentially a trade-off. I think, as Dirk mentioned, it can be the case that policymakers lag behind where the market is, and I think that it's not necessarily the case that all privacy regulation needs to be innovation stifling. I think that's something really important to note, and that's both true thinking about incumbent firms. It's also true thinking about competition. It's something that Tim Cook recently spoke about when it comes to access to Apple's App Store, and sort of the need to maintain quality and privacy protection for consumers is first order for Apple as an innovating firm. So I think on the one hand, regulation that makes consumers confident, and that allows innovators to act within a sort of transparent set of regulations, I think can be super effective, actually, in encouraging a lot more sort of active participation of consumers and others I think, you know, it can feel like this is zero sum, but I think it's not zero sum. And in particular, when you start taking into account the potential for technological change that provides access to data with sort of privacy protection built in, I would try to frame it in a way that's not zero sum.
It's interesting. We're gonna end with a final exchange on a probably way too sort of meta topic, but I am struck sort of listening to both of you. You know, we've had in the past times where people have questioned the sort of basic models, particularly of microeconomics, that sort of take consumer preferences as given, because we say, well, consumer preferences are shaped by their environment, and we've sort of had to deal with that in the past. But it seems like this is on a whole different level, that it really seems like a category mistake almost to take consumer preferences as kind of autonomous, the coming from an autonomous being, if what you're trying to regulate is the power of a company to shape preferences and even cause them to be created. So I just wondered, I mean, this is, I say it's sort of laughably big question for the last 5 minutes, but I think for both of you, I just wonder whether you feel like that we do have tools within economics to think about this situation where preferences themselves are fundamentally being shaped and driven by the algorithms of these companies, and sort of still think in a kind of consistent way as microeconomists, or whether that does present sort of a whole new challenge.
I think it does, you know. A lot of the decisions that we're making daily are decisions under uncertainty, and so where we have actually very little information, and what kind of information and how much information we'll get will affect our perception of the environment and our perception of the world, and therefore our decisions. And so to that extent, I think it is easy to see how how much we can be guided and steered by additional information that can be provided. I think health is a very good example, and I think an example that that I would point at for Noam's argument that we want to have an environment where individuals can trust that their data is being taken seriously. I would say a huge failure in the last 2 years is that really the ability of AI to do something significant was not used at all in our handling of the COVID crisis. So really there were no major innovations or platforms or abilities to trace that was done systematically. And my sense is that almost everywhere, the barrier was essentially a very deep-seated suspicion that this data would be used eventually against the individual. It would be not secure, it would not be private. And so a failure to have a framework in place for something, as simple as consumer preferences or which gadget I want to buy, then extrapolated to the health statutes led to basically a lack of innovation, a lack of data that we have to address really major policy issues. And so I think we want to think about establishing a framework that allows us to take advantage, especially where data could help us a lot. And so I think that's another point to say we really want to have a strong policy in place that allows us to take advantage of the ability and the power of data when we are in need of it.
That's an excellent point. And Noam, I guess we're going to end up giving you the last word. But I wonder what you think of that. But I think there's also, it does, if you've had decades of at least a school of thinking in competition theory that is putting the consumer preferences first, and now one has question marks about the corporate power and ability to change consumer preferences, that does affect the way you would think about policy. But Dirk is also, there's a whole other level of just do consumers have any confidence in the basic system and trust enough to provide information?
Yeah, so there's a great short novel written by the behavioral psychologist B.F. Skinner called Walden 2, and it depicts a world of psychologists who are sort of social engineers structuring incentives for a little community and guiding behavior in a socially desirable direction. And this little community is depicted in a way that's either utopian or dystopian, depending on your perspective. And I think that gets to the heart of what you're saying is maybe dystopian from the perspective of somebody who wants free will ex ante, and utopian ex post. And I think that is something of a philosophical social challenge. I would say I subscribe exactly to what Dirk said. At some level, there needs to be some amount of trust in institutions, and that trust can come from different sources, whether it's trust in a regulator, whether it's structuring our organizations so that we have some check on the incentives to exploit consumer data. So a consumer-owned cooperative would have very different incentives to use this data surplus compared to a company that's owned by its equity providers. And so I think we have different structures in place to generate some amount of consumer confidence that ex ante they can live with what they're going to get ex post.
Well, I think I think this can only count as an intellectual sort of amuse-bouche for people. There's plenty to spark intellectual curiosity here without answering all the questions by any means. But I think it served its purpose of being a very thought-provoking lunchtime chat with a lot of intellectual sustenance. We couldn't actually provide you with virtual sandwiches, alas. And we also have a sort of book recommendation. We have a short novel that you can read, World in Two. If you don't want to get through, I don't know, Shoshana Zuboff's Age of Surveillance Capitalism, you can just read the very short fictional version of that concern. But Dirk Bergemann and Noam Yuchtman, thank you very much, and thanks to everyone for listening.